You are stranded somewhere hot, somewhere dry, and you have no idea where the nearest river is. You have, roughly, 3 days. Not 3 days of comfort. 3 days before your organs start shutting down one by one. Your blood thickens. Your brain swells against your own skull. Your kidneys, desperately trying to save every last drop, start poisoning you with your own waste. 3 days, and that's if you're lucky enough to be resting in the shade. In the open sun, in real heat, you could be dead by the second. And yet somehow you are here, reading this. Which means every single one of your ancestors, for roughly 300,000 years, in deserts and savannas and ice age tundras and floodplains, found water in time. Every single one. Not most of them. All of them. Because it only takes one failure, one bad guess, one wrong turn into a dry valley, and that entire branch of your family tree stops existing before it starts. That should stop you for a second. Somewhere out there, thousands of generations of people who look nothing like you, speak nothing like you, and think about the world completely differently than you do, solved an enormous, silent, life-or-death puzzle over and over again, and they solved it well enough that you exist to not think about it. Here's the strange part. Finding water wasn't actually the hardest bit. Water is, geologically speaking, almost everywhere, if you know how to look. The truly brutal part, the part that killed far more people than thirst itself, was knowing which water wouldn't kill you a different way. Because contaminated water doesn't announce itself. It looks exactly like the water that saves your life. It just quietly, slowly, kills you over the following week instead of the following day. Ancient humans had to solve 2 problems stacked on top of each other, and get both of them right, thousands of times, with absolutely no margin for error. Let's start with the first one. Let's start with why finding water in the first place was so catastrophically difficult. Modern humans evolved primarily on the African savanna, and savannas are, for large stretches of the year, functionally hostile to a species that sweats as much as we do. Humans are, biologically, an unusually thirsty animal. We lost our fur specifically so we could cool ourselves through sweat, which let us run down prey animals over long distances in ways almost nothing else on the planet can match. But that adaptation comes with a brutal tax. A human working hard in heat can lose over a liter of water an hour. A camel, by comparison, can go days without drinking and barely notice. We built one of the most efficient hunting bodies in evolutionary history, and then attached it to one of the least water-efficient systems imaginable. It's a trade-off, and like most trades, somebody has to pay the bill. For 300,000 years, that bill came due almost daily. So how do you find water when you're an animal that needs it constantly, in landscapes where it's often invisible? The first tool wasn't clever engineering. It was observation, patient, relentless observation, applied over generations until it became instinct. Animals were the first water map. Long before humans understood hydrology, they understood behavior. Certain animals, elephants especially, are living water detectors. Elephants can smell water from miles away and will walk in perfectly straight lines toward it, cutting across landscapes with an almost supernatural confidence. Ancient humans who lived alongside elephant populations learned to simply follow those lines. If the elephants moved with purpose in one direction at dusk, there was almost certainly water at the end of it. Birds gave away secrets too. Certain finches and doves in arid regions need to drink daily, and will fly toward water sources at dawn and dusk with a directness that a trained eye could read like a compass. Watch enough bird flight patterns over enough mornings, and you build a mental map of every water source for miles, updated in real time, with zero equipment required. Plants told a second story. Certain trees and grasses, tamarisk, palm groves, patches of unusually green vegetation in an otherwise brown landscape, are visible proof that water exists close to the surface, even if you can't see it. Ancient foragers learned to read a green smudge on a distant horizon the way we read a highway sign. It wasn't guesswork. It was pattern recognition passed down so consistently that it eventually looked, to outside observers, almost like magic. And when there was no visible water at all, when the landscape gave up nothing on the surface, ancient humans developed one of the most underrated survival technologies in our entire history, the sip well. In the Kalahari Desert, sand hunter-gatherers, whose ancestors have lived in that landscape for tens of thousands of years, dig narrow, deep holes into dry riverbeds, sometimes more than a meter down, until they hit damp sand. Then, using a hollow reed or grass stem as a straw, they suck water up through the sand itself, which acts as a natural filter, and spit it into an empty ostrich egg for storage. An ostrich egg, hollowed out, cleaned, and sealed, can hold close to a liter of water, and a single person can bury a cache of a dozen of these eggs in the desert floor, marked with a subtle pile of stones only they will recognize, to be dug up months later on a return journey. That is not a primitive fallback. That is a fully engineered water storage and retrieval system, built without metal, without pottery, without writing, purely from observation, trial, and an intimate multi-generational relationship with a single stretch of land. Which brings us to the second problem. The one that actually did most of the killing. Let's talk about why finding water was never really the finish line. Water can look completely clean and still be lethal. A still pond, glassy and inviting under a hot sun, can be teeming with pathogens that cause dysentery, cholera, or parasitic infections that slowly wreck the digestive system over days. Unlike a predator, which announces itself immediately, contaminated water is patient. It waits. Drink from the wrong pool, and you might feel fine for hours, sometimes a full day, before the cramping starts. By then, you've often already given the same water to your children, your elders, your entire group, because it looked exactly the same as the water that never hurt anyone. This delayed feedback loop made bad water one of the most difficult threats in the ancient world to learn from directly, because the punishment didn't arrive fast enough to obviously connect to the crime. So how did ancient humans build reliable rules around something that lied to their senses? The first method was, once again, watching animals, but in a more specific and slightly darker way. Groups learned to notice which water sources animals actively avoided. A watering hole surrounded by animal tracks approaching from every direction but with no tracks actually leading up to the water's edge was a red flag passed down as folklore long before anyone understood bacteria. Animals, particularly herbivores with sensitive digestive systems, are remarkably good at detecting water that's gone bad, through smell and taste cues invisible to humans. A pool that herds consistently bypassed, even during severe drought when every other source was competed over fiercely, became marked as forbidden water in the oral knowledge of the group. Nobody needed to know why. They only needed to know that the pattern held, generation after generation, and that ignoring it had cost lives before. The second method was flow. Moving water is, on average, dramatically safer than still water because movement disrupts the stagnant conditions that bacteria and parasites need to multiply, and it constantly dilutes contamination with fresh volume. Ancient humans didn't need germ theory to notice that groups drinking primarily from streams and rivers got sick less often than groups relying on stagnant pools and puddles. Over enough generations, a strong cultural preference formed: always seek the source, always seek the current, never settle for the still water if moving water exists anywhere nearby. That single rule, encoded as instinct and taboo rather than science, likely saved more lives across human history than almost any single piece of ancient technology. The third method was filtration, and this is where things get genuinely inventive. In multiple regions independently, from parts of Africa to ancient communities in the Americas, humans discovered that passing water through sand, charcoal, and certain types of porous rock dramatically improved both its taste and its safety. Charcoal in particular has a natural ability to trap organic impurities and neutralize certain toxins, a property we still use today in modern water filters and even in medical charcoal treatments for poisoning. Ancient groups who lived near recurring fires would have had charcoal constantly available, and it likely didn't take long, across thousands of accidental experiments, for someone to notice that water strained through the ash and cooled coals of a fire pit tasted cleaner and caused less sickness than water taken directly from a suspicious pool. That observation, once it worked once, would have spread through a group almost immediately, because the stakes of getting it wrong were simply too high to ignore a solution that worked. The fourth method, and perhaps the most elegant, was heat. Boiling water is one of the single most effective ways to make it safe, killing the vast majority of dangerous pathogens within minutes. But here's the problem. Ancient humans, for the overwhelming majority of our history, had no fireproof containers. No metal pots. No ceramic that could survive direct flame. So how do you boil water without a pot that can touch fire? You use stone boiling. Heat rocks directly in a fire until they're almost glowing, then drop them, one by one, using sticks or tongs made of green wood, into a container that can't itself touch flame but can hold liquid, a hollowed log, a tightly woven basket sealed with pitch, even a stretched animal skin suspended over a frame. The hot stones transfer their heat directly into the water, and with enough stones added in sequence, the water reaches a full rolling boil without the container ever touching fire at all. Archaeological sites across multiple continents show fire-cracked rocks in enormous quantities, stones that shattered from repeated rapid heating and cooling, and for a long time, archaeologists underestimated just how much of that cracked stone represents not cooking, but water purification. This is a genuinely brilliant solution to a problem that looks, at first glance, almost unsolvable without modern materials. Let's pause here for a second, because there's something worth sitting with. None of these four solutions, animal observation, moving water preference, sand and charcoal filtration, and stone boiling, required writing. None of them required formal science. None of them required a single individual genius who figured it all out and told everyone else. They emerged slowly, through trial, tragedy, and careful transmission, refined across countless generations, each one adding a small correction to the last. This is knowledge built the way a river carves a canyon, not through one dramatic event, but through relentless, patient repetition, until the shape of the solution became inevitable. And this knowledge wasn't just practical. It was sacred. Across an enormous range of ancient cultures, water sources became genuinely spiritual sites, protected by taboo, myth, and ritual. Springs were treated as the dwelling places of spirits or ancestors. Certain wells were considered too powerful, too dangerous, or too holy to be used carelessly. At first glance, this can look like simple superstition layered on top of practical survival knowledge. But look closer, and the pattern is far more functional than it seems. Wrapping a life-critical resource in ritual and taboo is an extremely effective way to make sure the rules around it are followed precisely, without deviation, by every single member of a group, including children, including newcomers, including people in a hurry or in a panic. A rule that says the spirits will curse you if you drink from the still green pool is, in practice, functionally identical to a rule that says the bacteria in that pool will kill you, except the spiritual version requires no explanation, no biology lesson, and gets obeyed instantly, even by a frightened 7-year-old on their own for the first time. Ancient humans encoded survival science into the language of the sacred because sacred rules get followed without question, and when the cost of a single mistake is death, without question is exactly the compliance rate you need. Water knowledge also functioned as one of the most valuable forms of currency a group could possess, in a very literal sense. Knowing the location of a reliable spring during a drought, knowing which dry riverbeds held damp sand at a shallow depth, knowing which distant water source stayed full even in the harshest season, this information was often more valuable than any physical object a group could carry. It was passed down carefully, sometimes only to specific individuals, sometimes shared strategically with neighboring groups in exchange for other resources or alliances. Water knowledge could be traded, inherited, protected, or in times of extreme desperation, fought over. Entire migration routes across continents, the paths humans took as they spread out of Africa and eventually populated nearly every corner of the planet, were shaped as much by the location of reliable water as by any other single factor. We often talk about human migration in terms of climate and food, but water was frequently the actual constraint drawing the map, the invisible thread connecting one viable stopping point to the next across thousands of miles of otherwise unforgiving terrain. By the time humans began settling into the earliest permanent villages, thousands of years later, this deep well of accumulated water knowledge didn't disappear, it simply scaled up. The instinct to seek moving water led directly to the practice of building settlements beside rivers rather than farther inland. The technique of digging down into damp sand evolved into the first true wells, dug deeper and lined with stone to prevent collapse. The understanding that certain locations held water closer to the surface, learned originally from watching plants and animals, guided where those wells were placed in the first place. Later civilizations would build aqueducts, cisterns, and elaborate irrigation systems, and it's tempting to see those as a completely different category of achievement, engineering rather than survival instinct. But the underlying logic, find water, protect it from contamination, move it toward where people actually live, is a direct continuation of exactly the same problem ancient humans had already been solving, quietly and successfully, for hundreds of thousands of years before the first brick was ever laid. There's a strange kind of humility in all of this. We tend to imagine ancient humans as constantly on the edge of disaster, one bad decision away from extinction, stumbling through a hostile world with barely any control over their own survival. And in some ways that's true. The margins really were that thin. But the water story tells a different version of the same history. It shows a species that, without instruments, without written records, without anything we would recognize as formal science, built an extraordinarily sophisticated, layered system of environmental reading, filtration technology, cultural rulemaking, and generational knowledge transfer, refined specifically to solve one of the most silent and unforgiving threats they faced. They didn't just find water. They built an entire invisible infrastructure of behavior, myth, and technique around making sure that water didn't quietly kill them after they found it. Right now, you can walk to a tap, turn a handle, and clean, safe water appears instantly, tested, treated, and delivered through a system so reliable that most people never think about it at all. That convenience represents the very end point of a project your ancestors started walking barefoot across dry riverbeds, watching elephants at dusk, and burying ostrich eggs in the sand. Every rule they got right, every pool they learned to avoid, every stone they heated and dropped into a woven basket, every piece of sacred water taboo passed down to a child too young to understand bacteria, all of it accumulated, invisibly, into the world you're living in right now. You never had to learn to read an elephant's walk toward the horizon. You never had to taste the spring cautiously, one sip at a time, waiting to see if your stomach betrayed you hours later. Somebody else already did that. Thousands of somebody else's, actually, across 300,000 years, so that you wouldn't have to. And somehow, quietly, without you ever noticing, that was enough.